Hello, and welcome to our channel, Stories with Silas. We hope you enjoy watching.
The photograph in Sarah's pocket showed a man who disappeared 70 years ago, presumed dead. He was standing 15 feet away, serving water to the billionaire grandson who'd spent a lifetime searching for him. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The hush that fell over the Meridian, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, was absolute. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over white tablecloths, while the soft murmur of conversation and the gentle clink of fine china created a symphony of refined elegance. Yet in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. A young server stood motionless, her hand trembling as she clutched a faded photograph, her eyes moving between the elderly waiter beside her and the distinguished man seated at table 12. 3 generations, 70 years of separation, and one impossible moment of recognition converged in the candlelit dining room. Marcus Henderson had never been the type to dwell on the past. At 32, he was too busy building his real estate empire to worry about family mysteries that had haunted his childhood. He was the founder and CEO of Henderson Properties, a company that had transformed Manhattan's skyline with innovative luxury developments. Forbes had recently named him one of the city's youngest billionaires, and his face graced the covers of business magazines alongside titans like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Tonight, he'd arrived at the Meridian for what should have been a routine business dinner with potential investors from Singapore. The restaurant itself was legendary. Perched on the 65th floor of a gleaming tower in Midtown Manhattan, the Meridian offered breathtaking views of the city's lights stretching to the horizon. The executive chef, Thomas Rousseau, had trained under culinary masters in Lyon and held 3 Michelin stars. The waiting list for reservations stretched 6 months, and the dress code was so strict that even celebrities had been turned away for failing to meet standards. Marcus arrived precisely at 7, as was his habit. Punctuality was one of many principles his grandmother had instilled in him during those formative years after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8. She'd raised him alone, working multiple jobs to ensure he had every opportunity. She'd also told him stories about his grandfather, Joseph Henderson, who had disappeared during the family's migration from the South to New York in the 1950s. The tale had always seemed like something from another era. During the chaos of their move north, seeking better opportunities during the Great Migration, Joseph had gotten separated from the family at a train station. They'd searched for months, hired investigators, placed advertisements in newspapers across multiple states. But Joseph had vanished without a trace, presumed dead after several years. His grandmother had kept one precious photograph of Joseph taken on their wedding day in 1953, and Marcus had grown up staring at that faded image, wondering about the grandfather he'd never known. As Marcus settled into his seat at table 12, he scanned the restaurant's opulent interior with practiced appreciation. The walls featured original artwork, and each table was positioned to maximize privacy while offering spectacular city views. His business associates from Singapore hadn't arrived yet, giving him a moment to review the proposal documents on his tablet. That's when he noticed the elderly waiter approaching his table. The man moved with quiet dignity, despite his advanced years, his posture remarkably straight for someone who must have been in his late 80s. He wore the restaurant's crisp uniform, a burgundy jacket with gold trim, pressed black trousers, and a name tag that read simply, Joseph. "Good evening, sir," the waiter said, his voice soft but steady. "Welcome to the Meridian. May I start you with our signature cocktail while you wait for your party?" Marcus glanced up, offering a polite smile. "Just water for now, thank you." The old waiter nodded and turned to leave, but something made Marcus look twice. There was something about the man's profile, the way he carried himself, that sparked a strange sense of familiarity. But before Marcus could process the feeling, his phone buzzed with a message from his assistant about the Singapore investors running 15 minutes late. Across the dining room, Sarah Chen had just emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of appetizers. She was 24, working at the Meridian while completing her master's degree in social work at Columbia. The job paid well and gave her flexibility for classes, though the demanding environment often left her exhausted. As she approached her section, she noticed the elderly Joseph heading toward the service station. Her hand instinctively went to her pocket, where she kept a small photograph her late grandmother had given her before passing away 6 months ago. It was a peculiar keepsake, an image from her grandmother's days working in New York in the 1950s, showing a group of workers at a small diner in Harlem. Sarah Chen's grandmother, Wei Lin, had been a woman of few words, but deep wisdom. When she'd pressed that worn photograph into Sarah's hands during her final days in the hospital, she'd said something that had puzzled Sarah ever since. Sometimes the past finds us when we're ready to see it. The photograph showed 5 people standing outside a modest diner called Ruby's Place in Harlem, circa 1955. The image was creased and faded, the edges worn from decades of handling. Wei Lin had worked as a seamstress in that neighborhood, and she'd explained that these were friends from her early days in America, fellow immigrants and migrants who'd formed a tight-knit community during those difficult years. But it was one man in the photograph who'd always captured Sarah's attention. He stood slightly apart from the others, his expression contemplative, with a distinctive scar running along his left jawline. Wei Lin had told her his name was Joseph, and that he'd been kind to her when she first arrived in New York, barely speaking English and terrified of her new surroundings. He'd helped her find work, taught her how to navigate the city, and treated her like family. He had the saddest eyes, Wei Lin had said, her voice barely a whisper. He told me once that he'd lost his family, that he'd made a terrible mistake and could never go back. I never understood what he meant. Now, standing in the Meridian's elegant dining room, Sarah felt the photograph burning in her pocket. She'd taken to carrying it everywhere since her grandmother's death, a tangible connection to the woman who'd raised her after her own parents returned to China when she was 6. As Sarah delivered appetizers to table 7, she glanced toward the service station where Joseph was preparing a water service. Her heart skipped a beat. The angle of his face, the way the light caught his profile, it was unmistakable. The same scar, faded now but still visible, ran along his left jaw. Sarah's hands began to tremble. It couldn't be. The man in her grandmother's photograph would be nearly 90 years old now, but the Meridian's Joseph had worked here for over a decade, according to the other servers. He was quiet, intensely private, and known for his impeccable service and old-world courtesy. She'd never paid particular attention to him before, but now, with her grandmother's words echoing in her mind, Sarah couldn't look away. Joseph moved through the restaurant with practiced grace, his movements economical and efficient despite his age. There was a melancholy about him, a sense of carrying invisible burdens that seemed to match Wei Lin's description perfectly. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the maître d', Vincent Marchand, who approached with his characteristic briskness. "Miss Chen, table 12 needs attention. The guest is expecting his party shortly." She nodded, composing herself, and made her way toward Marcus Henderson's table. The billionaire was absorbed in his tablet, his expression focused and intense. Sarah had served plenty of wealthy patrons during her time at the Meridian, but Henderson had a reputation that preceded him. Despite his youth and success, he was known for being courteous to staff, unlike some of the restaurant's more demanding clientele. "Excuse me, Mr. Henderson," Sarah said softly. "Is there anything I can bring you while you wait?" Marcus looked up, offering a genuine smile. "I'm fine, thank you. though I have to say, your water service is impressively attentive here." Sarah smiled politely, but her mind was elsewhere. She watched as Joseph approached another table, and the resemblance to the photograph seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. The way he held himself, the careful dignity in his movements, it all aligned with the man her grandmother had known 70 years ago. But it was more than physical similarity. There was something about Joseph's demeanor, a quality of profound loss that Wei Lin had described. Her grandmother had said Joseph carried the weight of a broken family, that he'd mentioned being separated from his wife and infant grandson during the chaos of their journey north. Sarah's pulse quickened. Marcus Henderson was 32. His grandfather had disappeared during the Great Migration in the 1950s. The timeline aligned perfectly. Joseph Henderson moved through the meridian with the practiced invisibility that came from decades of service work. At 89 years old, he'd long ago perfected the art of being present yet unnoticed, attentive yet unobtrusive. It was a skill born of necessity and cultivated through years of shame. Every morning, Joseph woke in his modest studio apartment in Queens, took the subway into Manhattan, and arrived at the Meridian 2 hours before his shift. He used that time to prepare mentally for the day ahead, to steel himself against the memories that threatened to overwhelm him whenever he let his guard down. 70 years. That's how long it had been since the worst day of his life. He could still remember every detail of that September afternoon in 1953. He and his wife, Dorothy, along with their infant grandson, Marcus, his daughter had died in childbirth, had been part of the Great Migration, joining thousands of black families fleeing the Jim Crow South for opportunities in the North. They'd saved for months to afford the train tickets, carefully planning their journey to New York, where Dorothy's cousin had promised them a place to stay and help finding work. But at the Richmond train station during a layover, chaos had erupted. A fight had broken out on the platform, and in the confusion, Joseph had been separated from Dorothy and the baby. He'd searched frantically, running between platforms, calling their names until his voice was hoarse. But the crowds were too dense, the confusion too complete. By the time order was restored, his family was gone. The train they'd been planning to take had already departed. Joseph had spent his last dollars trying to find them, checking with station masters, placing desperate telephone calls to Dorothy's cousin in New York. But in those days before widespread communication and identification systems, finding lost loved ones was nearly impossible. For months, Joseph had searched. He'd worked odd jobs to survive, sleeping in shelters and cheap boarding houses, spending every spare moment trying to track down his family. He'd hired a private investigator who took his money and provided nothing but false leads. Eventually, Joseph learned that Dorothy and baby Marcus had made it to New York. But by then, more than a year had passed, and Joseph had made his choice, the choice that haunted him every single day since. He'd convinced himself that Dorothy and Marcus were better off without him. He was a man who'd failed to protect his family, who'd let them slip away in a moment of confusion. He'd arrived in New York broken, and consumed with self-loathing. How could he face Dorothy after abandoning them? How could he look his grandson in the eyes? So Joseph had stayed away. He'd followed their lives from a distance, learning through careful inquiries that Dorothy had found work, that she was raising Marcus alone. As years passed, he'd read about the boy's achievements in school, later his success in business. Joseph had cut out every newspaper article mentioning Marcus Henderson, keeping them in a worn shoebox in his apartment. He knew he was a coward. He knew that every day he stayed silent was another betrayal. But shame was a powerful force, and it had held Joseph captive for 7 decades. Working at the Meridian had been both torture and comfort. The restaurant attracted Manhattan's elite, and occasionally Joseph caught glimpses of the world his grandson inhabited. He'd even seen Marcus from a distance at a charity gala the restaurant had catered 2 years ago. Joseph had stood in the shadows, watching his grandson command a room full of influential people, and felt his heart swell with pride and shatter with regret simultaneously. Sarah's hands were shaking as she retreated to the service station. She pulled the photograph from her pocket, studying it under the soft lighting. The resemblance was undeniable. The scar, the shape of his eyes, even the way his ears sat slightly prominent. Every detail matched. Her mind raced through the implications. If this was the same Joseph from her grandmother's photograph, and if Marcus Henderson's grandfather had disappeared during the Great Migration, then the impossible was sitting right in front of her. The man serving water to Manhattan's elite was the missing patriarch of one of the city's most successful families. But Sarah knew she had to be certain. Making such an accusation without proof could cost her job and humiliate 2 people who didn't deserve such treatment. She needed to verify somehow, to find additional confirmation before approaching either man. She glanced back at table 12 where Marcus sat, now joined by 2 well-dressed Asian business people who'd arrived for the dinner meeting. They were deep in conversation, reviewing documents spread across the table. Joseph stood nearby, ready to take their orders, his expression professionally neutral. Sarah made a decision. During her break, she would search online for information about Marcus Henderson's family history. If the details matched what her grandmother had told her about Joseph, she would know for certain. The next hour passed in a blur of service. Sarah delivered courses, refilled wine glasses, and maintained her professional composure while her mind churned with possibilities. She watched Joseph interact with Marcus's table, noting how the elderly waiter's hands trembled slightly when he poured water for the billionaire. Was it simple nervousness at serving such a prominent guest, or was there something more? Finally, her break arrived. Sarah hurried to the staff locker room and pulled out her phone, typing Marcus Henderson family history into the search engine. The results appeared immediately. The first article was from New York Magazine, a profile piece published 3 years ago. Sarah's eyes scanned quickly through the text, her heart pounding. There it was, in the 3rd paragraph. Henderson's success is even more remarkable given his challenging childhood. Raised by his grandmother Dorothy Henderson after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8. Marcus often speaks about the sacrifices she made for him. Dorothy herself had raised Marcus's father alone after her husband Joseph Henderson disappeared during their migration from Virginia to New York in 1953. Despite extensive searches, Joseph was never found. Sarah's breath caught. Virginia. The Great Migration, 1953. Every detail aligned perfectly. She scrolled further, finding an older interview from Forbes where Marcus discussed his family legacy. "My grandmother told me stories about my grandfather Joseph," he'd said. "She described him as a kind man with strong principles who loved his family deeply. His disappearance was the defining tragedy of her life. She never remarried, never stopped hoping he'd return. When she passed away 5 years ago, one of her last wishes was that if I ever found any information about what happened to him, I would pursue it. But the trail went cold decades ago." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. Dorothy had died hoping for answers, never knowing that her husband was alive, working in restaurants across the city, too ashamed to come home. Another search revealed photographs of Marcus's grandmother. Sarah found an obituary from 5 years ago, complete with a photo of Dorothy Henderson at age 84. She'd been a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Sarah sat in the locker room, phone clutched in trembling hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Two men, separated by tragedy and shame for 70 years, were now in the same room, mere feet apart, completely unaware of their connection. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her like a physical force. Should she intervene? Did she have the right to insert herself into such a deeply personal situation? What if she was wrong, despite all the evidence? What if revealing the truth caused more harm than good? Sarah thought about her grandmother, about the stories Wei Lin had shared during those final hospital visits. Joseph was a broken man, her grandmother had said. He carried guilt like stones in his pockets. I tried to tell him that everyone makes mistakes, that families forgive, but he wouldn't listen. He said he didn't deserve forgiveness. The door to the locker room opened, and Maria Rodriguez, another server and Sarah's closest friend at the Meridian, entered. Maria was 42, a single mother of 3 who'd been working at the restaurant for 15 years. She had a reputation for being both fiercely efficient and deeply compassionate. "You okay, Chica?" Maria asked, noticing Sarah's distressed expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Maria, I think I've discovered something impossible." Maria sat down beside her, concern etched across her features. "What is it?" The words tumbled out. Sarah explained about her grandmother's photograph, about recognizing Joseph, about her research into Marcus Henderson's family history. She showed Maria the photograph, then pulled up the articles on her phone, walking her friend through every connection she'd made. Maria's eyes widened as the story unfolded. "Dios mío," she whispered. Sarah, this is incredible and terrible. That poor man has been living with this guilt for 70 years. "I don't know what to do," Sarah admitted. "Should I tell them? Should I stay out of it? What if Joseph doesn't want to be found? What if Marcus doesn't want to know?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she took Sarah's hand and squeezed it gently. "Mi abuela used to say that some things happen for a reason. Your grandmother gave you that photograph before she died. You're working here tonight, when both men are in the same room. Maybe this is meant to be. But what if I'm wrong?" Sarah protested weakly. "Are you wrong?" Maria challenged. "Look at the evidence. The scar, the timeline, the names, the story. Everything matches. And more than that, look at your heart. You know the truth. You can feel it." Sarah nodded slowly, wiping her tears. Maria was right. Deep down, she knew with absolute certainty that the elderly waiter and the billionaire were grandfather and grandson. "If you were in their position," Maria continued softly, "wouldn't you want to know? Wouldn't you want the chance to make things right, even if it's painful?" Sarah thought about her own parents living in China, the years of separation that had marked her childhood. She thought about the ache of missing people you loved, of questions left unanswered. Yes, she would want to know. Even if the truth was difficult, it was better than living with absence and uncertainty. "You're right," Sarah said, straightening her shoulders. "I have to tell them." "But how?" Maria smiled encouragingly. "Start with the grandson. Show him the photograph. Let him decide how to approach Joseph. That way, you're giving them both the gift of choice." Sarah's heart pounded as she returned to the dining room. Marcus Henderson's business dinner was winding down. The Singapore investors were gathering their documents, shaking hands, and offering satisfied smiles that suggested the meeting had gone well. Sarah knew she had only a brief window of opportunity. She approached Vincent Marchand, the maitre d', her voice low and urgent. "Vincent, I need to speak with Mr. Henderson privately for just a moment. It's extremely important. Personal matter." Vincent's eyebrows rose skeptically. The Meridian had strict policies about staff interactions with guests outside of service requirements. "Miss Chen, you know we don't—" Please, Sarah interrupted, her voice cracking slightly. I promise you, this is something he needs to know. It's about his family. Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Vincent studied her face for a long moment, then nodded curtly. 2 minutes, and this better not be inappropriate. Sarah waited as the Singapore investors departed, exchanging final pleasantries with Marcus. The billionaire remained seated, reviewing notes on his tablet, looking pleased with how the evening had gone. This was the moment. Sarah approached the table, the photograph clutched in her hand. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself forward. "Mr. Henderson, I'm so sorry to disturb you, but I have something I need to show you. It's about your grandfather." Marcus looked up sharply, his expression shifting from polite attention to intense focus in an instant. "My grandfather? What about him?" Sarah's hands trembled as she held out the photograph. "My grandmother passed away 6 months ago. Before she died, she gave me this picture from 1955. She worked in Harlem back then, and she knew a man named Joseph Henderson. He told her he'd lost his family during the Great Migration." Marcus took the photograph carefully, his eyes scanning the faded image. Sarah watched his face change as he located the figure she'd indicated, the man with the distinctive scar along his jaw. That's impossible," Marcus whispered. His hand shook as he held the photograph closer to the light. "This scar. My grandmother described this scar. My grandfather got it as a teenager working in tobacco fields in Virginia." "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said softly, "I believe your grandfather is alive. I believe he's been alive this entire time." Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "What? How could you possibly—" "He works here," Sarah interrupted gently. "At this restaurant. He's been working here for over a decade." The colour drained from Marcus's face. He stared at Sarah as though she'd spoken in a foreign language, struggling to process words that seemed to defy reality. "That's not possible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "My grandmother searched for years. Private investigators, police reports, newspaper advertisements. She never stopped looking until the day she died." "I know," Sarah said, tears forming in her eyes. "My grandmother told me that Joseph was consumed with shame. He felt he'd failed his family. He convinced himself they were better off without him." Marcus stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Other diners glanced over curiously. "Where is he? Where is this man you think is my grandfather?" Sarah turned, scanning the dining room. Joseph was across the room, clearing table 7, his movements slow and methodical. "There," she said quietly. "The elderly waiter in the burgundy jacket." Marcus Henderson stood frozen, his eyes locked on the elderly waiter across the dining room. The photograph trembled in his hand as decades of questions, pain, and longing collided in a single moment. This man, this stranger who'd served him water just hours ago, could be his grandfather. The grandfather his grandmother had mourned until her dying breath. "I need to—" Marcus started, but his voice failed him. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. "I need to speak with him." Sarah nodded, understanding the magnitude of what was about to happen. "Would you like me to come with you?" Marcus shook his head, unable to tear his gaze away from Joseph. "No. I need to do this alone." He began walking across the dining room, his legs feeling disconnected from his body. Other patrons glanced up curiously as the impeccably dressed billionaire crossed the floor with such intensity, but Marcus barely noticed them. His entire world had narrowed to the elderly man who was carefully stacking used dishes onto a tray. As Marcus drew closer, he could see details he'd missed before. The way Joseph's hands moved with practiced efficiency despite their slight tremor. The silver hair, thinning but neatly combed, the lines etched deeply into his face, speaking of decades of hard work and harder memories. And yes, there on his left jaw, the scar. Faded now, barely visible, but unmistakably present. Marcus stopped 3 feet away, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain everyone in the restaurant could hear it. "Joseph?" he said quietly. The elderly waiter turned, his expression politely attentive. "Yes, sir? Is there something you need?" Marcus held up the photograph with shaking hands. "I need you to look at this picture and tell me if this is you." Joseph's eyes dropped to the image, and in that instant his entire demeanor changed. The color drained from his face. His hands went still. His breathing stopped. Marcus watched as recognition, shock, and something close to terror flickered across the old man's features. "Where?" Joseph's voice was barely a whisper. "Where did you get this?" "A server here. Her grandmother knew you in the 1950s. She kept this photograph." Marcus took a step closer, his voice urgent. "Is this you? Is your name Joseph Henderson?" The elderly man's legs seemed to give out. He gripped the edge of the table for support, his eyes never leaving the photograph. I don't... My name is Marcus Henderson," Marcus continued, his voice breaking. "My grandmother was Dorothy Henderson. She raised me after my parents died. She told me stories about her husband who disappeared during their migration to New York in 1953. She told me about a scar he got working tobacco fields in Virginia." Joseph's eyes lifted slowly to meet Marcus's, and in them Marcus saw 70 years of pain, regret, and recognition. The old man's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. "Are you my grandfather?" Marcus asked, the question emerging as barely more than a breath. Time seemed to suspend itself. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking silverware, the murmured conversations, the soft music all faded into background static. There was only this moment, this question hanging in the air between two men separated by 7 decades and 3 feet of space. Joseph's hands came up to his face, covering his eyes. His shoulders began to shake. When he finally lowered his hands, tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Marcus," he whispered, the name like a prayer. "Oh, God. Marcus, my grandson." The confession hung in the air like something tangible, something that could be touched and held. Marcus stood motionless, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible reality before him. This elderly waiter, this man who'd served him water earlier with such quiet dignity, was his grandfather, the man his grandmother had searched for until her dying day, the ghost that had haunted 3 generations of Hendersons. "Grandpa," Marcus breathed, and suddenly the distance between them evaporated. He surged forward, catching Joseph as the old man's knees buckled completely. Marcus wrapped his arms around his grandfather, holding him up, feeling the fragility of bones beneath a uniform jacket, the trembling of a body racked with emotion. Joseph clung to his grandson, 7 decades of loneliness and shame pouring out in great gasping sobs. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry. I failed you. I failed your grandmother. I failed everyone." "No!" Marcus said fiercely, his own tears flowing freely now. "No, you're here. You're alive. That's all that matters." Around them, the meridian had fallen completely silent. Every diner, every server, every member of the kitchen staff who'd emerged to witness the scene, all stood frozen, watching 2 men embrace in the middle of the elegant dining room. Several women were crying openly. Even hardened business executives were wiping their eyes. Sarah stood near table 12, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Maria had appeared beside her, arm around Sarah's shoulders, both women witnessing the reunion they'd helped orchestrate. Vincent Marchand, the normally stoic maitre d', dabbed at his eyes with his pocket square. Joseph pulled back slightly, his weathered hands coming up to cup Marcus's face, studying the features he'd only seen from a distance or in newspaper photographs. "You look like your grandmother," he whispered. You have her eyes, her strength. She never stopped looking for you, Marcus said, his voice breaking. Even at the end, when she was dying, she asked me to keep searching. She loved you until her last breath. The words hit Joseph like physical blows. His face crumpled with fresh anguish. I knew. I followed her life, read every obituary notice, every tribute. I stood at the back of her funeral 5 years ago. I watched you give her eulogy, and I wanted to die from the pain of knowing I'd wasted our time together, that I'd let shame and cowardice keep me from the woman who was my whole world. Marcus's grip on his grandfather tightened. Why? Why did you stay away? Joseph shook his head, tears still falling. I convinced myself you were better off without me. I was the man who'd lost his family, who'd failed in my most basic duty to protect you both. What kind of man loses his wife and grandson at a train station? His voice was raw with self-recrimination. I thought Dorothy deserved better. I thought you deserved better. We deserved you, Marcus said firmly. Flawed and imperfect and guilty of being human, we deserved to have you in our lives. Chef Thomas Rousseau had emerged from the kitchen, his eyes wide with wonder. He'd worked alongside Joseph for over a decade, sharing early morning preparations and late-night cleanups, yet had never imagined such a story lay hidden beneath the quiet waiter's reserved exterior. Patrons began to applaud, softly at first, then building into a crescendo that filled the dining room. Some stood, offering a standing ovation to the reunion unfolding before them. Marcus barely registered it, his attention entirely focused on the grandfather he'd believed dead for his entire life. I have so many questions, Marcus said, pulling back to look at Joseph's face. So much I want to know. Where have you been? How have you lived? Vincent Marchand approached quietly, his professional composure restored despite the emotion still visible in his eyes. Mr. Henderson, perhaps you and your grandfather would be more comfortable in our private dining room. You'll have privacy there. Marcus nodded gratefully, keeping one arm around Joseph's shoulders as they made their way through the restaurant. Diners watched them pass, many still wiping tears, offering encouraging smiles and nods of support. Sarah and Maria followed at a respectful distance, neither wanting to intrude, but both invested in the outcome of this impossible reunion. The private dining room was an intimate space with rich mahogany paneling, a single round table, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's glittering skyline. Vincent personally brought in water and coffee, then discreetly withdrew, closing the door behind him. Marcus helped his grandfather into a chair, then sat beside him, still holding Joseph's hand as though afraid he might disappear again. "Start from the beginning," Marcus said gently. "Tell me everything." Joseph took a shaky breath, his eyes distant with memory. "After we got separated at Richmond Station, I searched everywhere. I spent every dollar I had trying to find you both. I called your grandmother's cousin in New York, but the message never reached her, not until weeks later. By then, Dorothy had already arrived and started building a new life." He paused, accepting the water glass Marcus offered him with trembling hands. "When I finally learned you'd made it safely to New York, more than a year had passed. I was working as a dishwasher in Baltimore, sleeping in a boarding house with 6 other men in one room. I was broken, Marcus, physically exhausted and mentally destroyed by what I'd let happen." "It wasn't your fault," Marcus interjected, but Joseph shook his head firmly. "I convinced myself it was. I convinced myself that Dorothy had realized during that year apart that she was better off without me, that she'd see me as a failure, as weak. The shame ate at me every day." Joseph's voice cracked. "So I made the worst decision of my life. I decided to stay away, to let you both have a fresh start without the man who'd lost you." Marcus felt anger rise in his chest, not at his grandfather, but at the circumstances, the pride, the 70 years of unnecessary separation. Grandma never stopped wearing her wedding ring. She never even dated another man. She told me stories about you until the day she died. Joseph's face twisted with anguish. I know. I followed her life from a distance. I sent money anonymously sometimes through various channels. I attended parent-teacher conferences for your father when he was in school, standing in the back where Dorothy wouldn't see me. I was at your father's funeral after the car accident. His voice dropped to a whisper. I was at Dorothy's funeral 5 years ago. I heard you speak about her love for the husband she'd lost, and I wanted to stand up and scream the truth, but I was too cowardly. You attended my father's funeral? Marcus asked, stunned. You were there when I was 8 years old? Joseph nodded miserably. I stood under a tree about 50 yards away. You wore a black suit that was too big for you. Dorothy held your hand the entire service. I wanted so desperately to approach you both, to introduce myself, to beg forgiveness. But what right did I have after so many years of silence? Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window, struggling to process the revelation that his grandfather had been present at critical moments throughout his life, always watching from the shadows. The thought of 8-year-old Marcus grieving his parents, unaware that his grandfather stood nearby, made his chest ache. All those years, Marcus said quietly, Grandma talked about you like you were a hero. She told me you were brave and kind and strong. She never blamed you for what happened. Joseph looked up at his grandson, tears still streaming down his weathered face. She never blamed me, even after all those years? Never, Marcus said firmly, returning to sit beside his grandfather. She told me that what happened at that train station could have happened to anyone, that the chaos, the confusion, it was beyond anyone's control. She blamed herself for not holding your hand tighter. She blamed the circumstances, the era, the system that made life so difficult for families like ours. He took Joseph's hands in his own. The only person who blamed you was you. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Joseph closed his eyes, letting them sink in, feeling something inside him begin to crack, the hard shell of shame and self-punishment he'd carried for 70 years. I don't know how to let go of this guilt, Joseph whispered. It's been my companion for so long. Marcus squeezed his grandfather's hands. You don't have to let it go alone. We'll work through it together, you and me. We've lost enough time. I'm not losing another day. But your life, Joseph protested weakly. You're successful, important. You don't need an old man who works as a waiter, who has nothing to offer you. You're my grandfather, Marcus said, his voice breaking with emotion. You're the connection to my grandmother, to my father, to the family history I thought I'd never fully understand. You have everything to offer me. He paused, then added with fierce determination, and you're not working as a waiter anymore. You're retiring. Tonight, you're coming home with me. Joseph's eyes widened in shock. Marcus, I can't just... Yes, you can. Marcus interrupted gently but firmly. I have a brownstone in the Upper West Side with more rooms than I know what to do with. You're moving in. Tomorrow we'll go to your apartment and pack your things. We're family, Grandpa. That's what family does. For the first time since the reunion began, Joseph smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that transformed his entire face. Family, he repeated softly, as though testing the word on his tongue after decades of isolation. A soft knock interrupted the moment. The door opened slightly, and Sarah peeked in hesitantly. I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to check if you needed anything. Marcus stood immediately, crossing to Sarah and taking both her hands in his. You gave me my grandfather back. You gave us both a second chance. I can never repay that gift. Sarah shook her head, tears flowing freely. My grandmother would have wanted this. She talked about Joseph with such fondness, such concern. She'd be so happy to know he's found his family again. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his business card. I want to stay in touch. Your grandmother preserved this connection across 70 years. That matters. He paused, then added, and I'd like to make a donation to Columbia in her name, a scholarship for social work students. Would that be appropriate? Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, overwhelmed. That would be incredible. Thank you. Joseph stood on shaky legs, joining them at the door. He looked at Sarah with profound gratitude. You're an angel. You gave me back my life. 2 hours later, Marcus and Joseph walked out of the Meridian together, grandfather and grandson side by side, for the first time in 70 years. The night air was crisp and cool, the city lights brilliant against the dark sky. Marcus had arranged for his driver to take them back to his brownstone, where a guest room was already being prepared. As they settled into the back of the car, Joseph looked out at the city he'd called home for decades but had never truly lived in. Always existing on the margins, always hiding in the shadows. Now, finally, he could step into the light. Marcus, Joseph said quietly, your grandmother. Tell me everything about her life. I want to know it all. Marcus smiled, pulling out his phone to show photographs. Dorothy at his college graduation, at the opening of his first building, at family dinners and holiday celebrations. Each image was a piece of the life Joseph had missed, but also a testament to the woman who had loved him until her last breath. As the car drove through Manhattan's illuminated streets, grandfather and grandson began the long journey of reclaiming lost time, building new memories, and honoring the love that had survived 7 decades of separation. Sometimes it only takes one moment, one person brave enough to speak up, one photograph preserved across generations to bring a family home.